Hopefully you've got your pew Bibles in front of you. We're just going to turn to that passage from 2 Corinthians chapter 12 where we were reading earlier. And just as I'm turning to that passage, the strangest thing happened to me in preparing this particular Bible passage. I did write the first draft of the sermon a little while ago, and without being too melodramatic about what happened, is that I got the largest splinter from a pencil that I've ever got in my life. And perhaps you're up sitting there thinking, what sort of an idiot gets a splinter from a pencil? But I was sort of sitting there casting my thoughts down on this passage and how I might approach it. And then suddenly, it seemed like about half of the pencil landed into my finger just below the nail. And when I got the glasses out and able to extract that, but the next day, I still was aware of where that splinter had been. Because every time I went to grip or to hold a pencil, there really was quite a jump of pain after that. But that's sort of ironic when I'm looking at the passage in question where I was actually trying to study, because the word that Paul uses when he's talking about thorn is literally a splinter. And you know what a splinter or a thorn is? I mean, it's something really tiny. It's something that's almost insignificant, and yet the pain that comes from it is way beyond what we might normally expect that size of a thing actually to produce. And yet Paul is famous for having his thorn in the flesh. Lots of people wonder what exactly Paul was talking about when he says it here. Some people think it's to do with his eyesight. He was losing his eyes. For instance, in the book of Galatians, he talks about, see with what large letters I write. Or some people might actually think it was more of a character flaw that he was referencing. There was something just about him as an individual that he felt just wasn't right. It irked other people. Or it may have been a besetting sin, something that he kept falling into. And the bottom line, really, in all of this is that genuinely we don't know what it was. And that's good, because what that allows us to do is to look at our own lives and, as it were, to plunk our own lives into this situation, this trial, this difficulty, this thorn, and we think about ourselves and that we might be able to more readily and easily apply this Bible passage to us. But the important thing to remember is what a thorn is. It's simply something that doesn't go away. I mean, regular trials, difficulties come and go. But a thorn is something that lingers. It's something that persists. And it just won't go away. It's kind of annoying. And the title that I'm coming to you with this morning, in thinking about trials and fixations and where we have been reflecting over this past couple of weeks, but today I'm just considering, why is it that some of these things just never seem to end and that they never seem to go away? And I could give a simple answer and just sit down, but I've got a few minutes yet, so I'm not just going to sit down after this. But the simple answer is in what Paul writes in verse 7. When you see it in there, it was given in order to keep me from becoming conceited. That's the simple answer. To keep his feet on the ground, to teach him something that otherwise he wasn't going to learn, to keep him humble. Or reading down into verse 10, that is why for Christ's sake I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Now the issue with all of that is that that's not a lesson that we would readily want to learn. It's not something that we want to experience. We don't like difficulties. We don't like hardships. We don't like weaknesses. And particularly, just bearing in mind how Paul writes here, the first few verses are really Paul defending his ministry. Because in Greek culture, a flashy show was what was regarded as significant. So if you wanted people to listen to you, you had to come across sounding impressive. You had to come across sounding significant. And so all these other Greek teachers of the day would have been saying, look at me, look what I've done, look what I've learned, look what I can do. And yet all Paul was doing was emphasizing at times his weaknesses. And yet Paul was saying, you know, if I wanted to, I could tell people about the significant, mystical experiences I've had. So the first few verses in chapter 12, he says, 14 years ago, this happened to me. I was taken up into the third heaven, and I had this wonderful, mystical experience. And Paul says, if I wanted to, I could talk about those things, but I'm not going to, because God has given me this thorn to keep me humble. And that's a bit of a warning to us. It's an aside, I think, that we should listen to, that we shouldn't simply be overly impressed by people who put on a big show, or people who talk about themselves, or who describe wonderful mystical experiences to the extent that you begin to wonder that you are a little bit insignificant compared to them, to the degree that you might even begin to wonder, am I really a Christian? Because I'm not like that. So we need to be wary of things like that. But it's not saying that people haven't had deeply significant, even mystical experiences. Maybe that God has given them something, but it's a personal thing. Yet Paul is saying here, I've got this thorn, and it keeps me on the ground. And as I was saying, a thorn is something that doesn't go away. And it's God teaching us a lesson that we wouldn't otherwise readily learn. And it's not an easy lesson to learn. Which is why I really want you to focus on that word that's up there. Because I think where it all comes down to is whether or not we can accept your thorn. And that's a process. Doesn't come overnight. I mean, who wants these difficulties? Who wants these hard moments? It didn't come immediate to Paul. Look at verse 8. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord, take it away from me. Paul didn't want this. And it's like God was saying to Paul, God saying to us, you're going to get this. And we're saying, yeah, I know, I already get it. I understand. I've got enough. But God continues to say, but you're going to get this in a way you've never got it before. And in a way that you've never had it before. This thorn will hurt longer and deeper and harder than anything that you've ever experienced to date. But you're going to be changed through it. And of course, we don't like that sense of difficulty. And any thorn can be unpleasant. But let's remember what God is trying to do through it. He's trying to teach you a lesson. Even when you would rather run 1,000,000 miles away from it. And perhaps that's our experience today, that we would rather run away. We don't want to learn this. And so the process of accepting your thorn can be a hard one. I think the best way to describe it, if some of you have very young kids, or I'm sure most of you have probably had very young kids at some point, but remember those times when you were having to take them to the bath. And before going to the bath, they were very happy playing with a toy, watching TV, and your first job is to catch them. Then you have to take them screaming and twisting and contorting all over the place. But finally, you get them up to the bath, and you throw them into the bath, and still they're screaming and squiggling and doing all sorts of things. But gradually, there's an acceptance of their changed environment. Whenever the bubbles start to rise, and they've got new toys and rubber duckies in there with all of the rest of them, and then they accept where they are, to the degree that after a little while, that water that was once warm has become tepid, and you need to add more water to the bath because they don't want to leave the bath. That, I think, perhaps is the best way to describe for us what it means in that process of accepting your thorn. You don't like that degree of change. And the key, I think, getting to that point comes from that experience of being close to God. That experience, I think we could also just see as time in prayer. I think verse 8 is significant for us, where Paul is describing how he talks to God about this, and he's pleading with God to take this from him, and it's through that process that he accepts what God is now doing in his life. And then as we read on into verse 9, I think, again, I'm conscious that this is something that Paul has gained through that prayer and an understanding of spending time with God, because here he quotes, and this is the only time in the New Testament that Paul quotes something that God has said to him. So it's significant. Now, I know there's that account of Paul on the road to Damascus, and we hear the voice of Jesus to him, but that's Luke recording that. This is the only time Paul actually says something that God directly said to him. So as we look at verse 9, it's saying, "My grace is sufficient for you." And it's like God is saying to Paul, if you're going to get through this, you're going to need my grace. Without my grace, you're going to get crushed. Without my grace, you're going to become bitter and hard. And we wonder what exactly is meant by grace here. Perhaps something like Romans 16 verse 10 expands a little bit, where it talks about the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. So it's a sense of what Jesus is able to give us. It's the presence of Jesus. And then just thinking about this actual verse here, verse 9, and the word order in the original, I think, is significant, because maybe it says, "Sufficient for you is the grace of me," says Jesus. So it's the presence of Jesus. It's the strength that Jesus gives. It's finding courage and perseverance and confidence in Jesus. And what he also says about it is that my power is made perfect in weakness. And that word perfect means complete, finalized, finished. And that's the same sort of root word that Jesus said when he died on the cross, and he said, "It is finished." So coming to that place whereby we can accept that is a long road. But we need to accept it. We need to submit to it. We need to embrace it. We need to rest in God's presence. And that's the process by which we get there. It's not an easy route, but it's spending that time, that significant time with God, leaving it before him, laying out our difficulties with it, and wanting to hear God's take on this, and experiencing that. If I read verses 9 into verse 10, just so you get the whole picture of it. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. And that is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses. You know, you don't get there by keeping God at the periphery of your life. And that's the place where so often we would prefer to leave God, because it doesn't get too intrusive. It doesn't demand too much. If I can keep him there and I can control what God is doing or pushing me, then I feel safe. And yet, you'll never be able to accept the difficulties if you're keeping God at a distance and at the periphery of your life. You need to open yourself and to be in that place where you're listening and waiting and anxiously pouring out yourself before God. This is when you want God in your life, opening yourself to God. It's like that experience of Moses, when Moses was before God and what he wanted more than anything else in the world. And he said, show me your face. I want to encounter you. And that's what it is to accept, that process of accepting your thorn. But I don't want to leave you simply with that. Because the next point I just want to say, and the next slide is going to come, is about winning through your thorn. Actually, just yesterday, in the funeral I was conducting, I did read from Job chapter 23. And I was reading verse 10, which is a famous verse where Job was experiencing his struggles. And in the midst of Job experiencing those struggles, he still has the reassurance, and it's this, that God knows the way that I take. Because God is still looking over me. He's still there for me. And Job expands that a little bit. And I'm sure you'll know the rest of what he says. He says, when he has tested me, I shall come forth as gold. That's the picture I was painting last week about the refiner's fire. It's the refinery again. When God has tested me, I shall come forth as gold. And I was thinking a little bit more about what exactly is involved in that. Whenever you've got the gold ore, it's full of impurities, it's dirty, it's not good for making any fancy jewelry. It needs to be refined. And to do that, the refiner needs to really crank up the heat so that that ore is molten and it melts and it's a liquid. And then the next stage of that is that they would add some sort of flux into that so that it attracts the impurities, and the impurities can be gathered together. And then the stage after that again is to cool the gold down as it's poured into molds, and the impurities and that flux sort of float to the surface. And when it cools down completely, you can simply just crack off the flux and the impurities. And that process is repeated time and again to get the gold more pure each time. And that process actually hasn't changed at all, even with the advancement of technology over all these years. So Job's image of being refined in the fire and coming forth as gold is as vivid as ever. And the bottom line in all of this is that God is refining you today, right now. And so it might be, as you have been in the process of trying to accept your thorn, that maybe you can feel the heat as well. Maybe you can even experience that sense of the slag and that refinery process rising to the top. And our word for that, of course, would be sin. And that's something that God is exposing, that God is dealing with. That's what God is working at in your life. That's what you're trying to come through so that you can win through this. But actually, I have one last thought this morning. Because in that process of being refined, when you go through the refinery and you're in the furnace, you will either get burnt or you will be refined and come forth as gold. And as I looked at verse 7 again and describing that thorn, there was something that hit me that really I'd never consciously paused over before, because it was another description that Paul gives of the thorn itself. And remember, this is a thorn that Paul understands that God is using, and that God has brought into his life, and that God is doing something through, and that God is sovereignly over that, and God is working through that. But also look at one of the descriptions that he adds to the thorn. He says, this thorn in my flesh, and then he says, it was a messenger of Satan. In other words, even these things that God is using, Satan can add a message to it. It's like Satan stamped something on it. And we all recognize those little messages from Satan. You know, it's things that say to us, you're no good, or you'll never amount to anything, or that you're a failure, or that God has forgotten about you, or that God doesn't care about you. Those are all little messages that Satan might add to something that's going on in your life right now, and you know that you are susceptible to listening and hearing those things because that's the way that we're configured, and that those things become significant to us, and we can't get those thoughts out of our heads. So Paul, when he's writing here, and he's writing about the thorn and what God is doing in your life, it's like he's saying there are two things. There's God's voice here and what God is doing, and there's also Satan's message, which he attaches to it. So when any problem comes into your life, there will clearly be a word from God. But it's likely also that Satan will try and attach a message to that. And actually how you cope with that will depend on whose voice you're listening to, who you're attentive to. So that as you go through that process, your well-being, your strength, your encouragement, or your discouragement and your sense of failure will all result from the fact, who are you listening to? And what God is wanting to do. So accepting your thorn and winning through your thorn. And it is a process. It takes time. It's not easy. Just listening to what God is doing, learning what God is doing in your life. And the key to all of that is spending time resting in God's presence. At this point, I'm going to ask our musicians to come forward. They're going to sing a song for us, which you may well know, but it's arranged slightly differently, so they're just going to sing this song for us. And it's Be Still, My Soul. And I think it's relevant simply because there are those times when we do need to be still and see what it is that God is saying to us.